Roll here. This meeting is being recorded for the and the audio will be shared on YouTube and Provo City Council after the meeting. Please be aware that the microphone in the middle of the room picks up noise and the rustle of papers. Further be aware that microphones can pick up side conversations.
Open mic, huh?
Yeah.
So people have to watch us eat?
Yes, unless
People like to even hear us.
But thank you for being here. We appreciate the time. We know this gets to be a real crazy and busy time for you. We'll begin with the roll call, and Bryce, we'll start with you.
Bryce Mumford.
Kelsey Zarbach. Elizabeth Vanderwissen.
Cliff Strachan.
Dave Connect.
You're involved here, though.
Kurt Bramble.
Margaret Dayton.
Isaac Paxton.
Gary Winterton.
David Hardy. George Handley. Norm Thurston.
Kay Van Buren.
Thank you very much. Isaac Paxman, Deputy Mayor. I don't know if you've met him. We're grateful to have him on board with us in the city now, but he will give our opening prayer.
Our Father in heaven, we're thankful to be here this morning. We're thankful for the opportunities that we have. We're thankful for this community we live in. We're grateful for the service of so many before us and for those here and for those not here who do so much to strengthen and build our community. We ask that thy blessings will be upon us as we communicate, that our minds will be clear, that our thoughts will be enlightened when appropriate and necessary. And again, we just thank you for this opportunity. We ask a blessing on this meal and on all the events of our days, that we'll be safe and have thy help as we go about things. And we pray for these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. There's Brian. We welcome Wayne Parker and Brian Jones. And Brian?
Yes.
This is noticed as these things. I don't sleep at night. Sometimes my brain gets going, and I thought of two other things that I'd like to discuss, but maybe that will need to be done in private.
Well, you're not taking any action on them.
Nope.
So, I mean, if you want to, did we put other business at the end? Probably not.
Okay, we'll talk. If we have time, we'll talk about it.
If you want to introduce them, I think you're okay, but.
I misunderstood the purpose. I thought this meeting was to have a two-way conversation about things that we were dealing with at the legislature that were directly going to affect.
That's exactly what it is.
It's not on the agenda. And if this is a publicly noticed meeting that goes right to the issue with your attorney, these upland parade look wonderful, but they don't. There are other issues that we're dealing with at the legislature that are directly going to affect you. So,
And that's that's what I was thinking too, Kurt, and I appreciate that. And that's why I wanted to open that discussion, even though it may not say.
Well, we probably should have put an item on the agenda for other business. I think that to the degree that the legislators who have been invited here have items that they want to bring up, that in some ways that's kind of similar to public comment in our other meetings, that if they want to introduce items and discuss them with you, I think that's okay. The main issue under state law is that you just can't take any action on it.
Thank you.
I'm not sure you guys should take any action on legislative matters to begin with.
That's right. But
I'm not sure. I
State
think the Constitution has a lot to do with that. I'm not sure.
and I appreciate you bringing that up, Kurt. Let's start off with number one here, and Dave, it looks like they've kind of been assigned a couple of things, so I'll let you start off.
Well, just real briefly, I think there may already be a bill that I read about related to this, but I just wanted to pass on some feedback. I've heard from a number of Provo residents that would be interested, I think, in shortening the window of that fireworks are allowed. As you know, in this valley, we have inversion problem, and we have some who are sensitive to that and kind of try to stay indoors during that period of the increased particulates that result from the fireworks. So that's really all I have in that.
I had thought, I mean, I could be wrong on this, but I had thought that the state statute is broader, but the city is welcome to narrow that window. Is that true? Right.
We can narrow it in the sense that the fire chief can designate areas where they can't.
But you can't.
We don't have any control over the time frame.
Yeah. And would that help if nothing else, but just say, well, cities can tighten the times and dates on their own.
They cannot under the current
That's another current
statute.
statute.
We've already limited those. This comes through business labor. And with the privilege of chair of business labor, my House co-chair, Representative Dunnigan, has House Bill 38. If you go to le.utah.gov, it's already a public bill that further restricts the use of fireworks. Happy to, if there's further amendments to that bill, let me know. You might want to review that bill first. The short title, amends and clarifies states in which a person may legally discharge fireworks. And if you go down into the bill, let's see if I get to the,
Down lines 125, starting around there's
yeah,
dates.
What was the bill number again, Senator?
it's
House Bill 38.
House Bill 38. If you go to le.utah.gov, go under bills, go under Dunnigan, it'll pop up as one of his numbered bills. This is an interim committee bill, but we had significant input from the League of Cities and Towns on the bill.
Okay.
It came out as a I believe,
I haven't read this yet. Does this shorten the time period then? Or is it keep the time period the same? What does it? Briefly?
It's short, 4 weeks maybe, so 7, something like that. That would probably address.
let's see. Why don't you move on to the next?
Okay, we will do that. We'll move
Yes,
on.
and here it is. It's on lines 200 through 202. Instead of July 1st, it's beginning on July 2nd. Instead of ending on July 7th, it's ending on July 5th. So it limits it to July 2nd through the 5th, July 22nd through 25th, instead of the 21st through the 27th. And beginning at 11 a.m. on December 31st, ending 1 a.m. on January 1st.
And it increases penalties for people who like that.
And it increases your ability to close areas. That's in lines, it looks like 112 through roughly 134.
I think what we can do then is see how it goes through the state. If you have input, I'm sure these folks are really welcome that input, and then we can deal with it after it goes through the state, I think. Any other questions on that?
It's nice to be responsive. Did it take us too long to respond?
Yeah, that-
We solved that problem.
This easy.
We know that your time, you've got other appointments.
No, I'm just saying. You better put in the ice ones.
That's good.
I think in light of the fact that the legislators here have things they want to talk to us, that as we go through our 8 items, just quickly introduce them, tell them these are things that we're interested in, and maybe not spend too much time on them so that we can have that dialogue.
I would love that. Dave, you want to just briefly introduce the second one?
Yeah, then, this one doesn't come up very often, so we don't need to spend much time on it, but for 3 weeks and 1 day, I served as the acting mayor after Mayor Curtis resigned, and it was a great experience, and on most issues, it worked out just fine, but there was one issue where I felt a real conflict between the 2 roles. And in other areas, like if the mayor is incapacitated, we don't have the council chair, according to state code, fill in like that. I think there's a list. Wayne, isn't there a list of 3 designated people from the administrative side that can fill in? So anyway, that experience, because of that conflict that I felt, it just caused me to wonder whether that's really the right way to go when a mayor resigns, or it should be more similar to the case where a mayor.
This is so unusual that I'm going to let you. Does anyone have any quick comments? Dave?
So, as the vice chair, I noticed that conflict and the inconsistency between if the mayor's incapacitated or if he resigns. And it just seemed kind of natural to have someone like Wayne Parker step in both cases.
I think the conditions that existed on this one were that we actually had a duly elected mayor whose term didn't begin until January 1st, but we had a vacancy in the mayor's office beginning on November 7th, 8th. And so it did create this really kind of weird scenario where the voters had spoken, and yet because of the time frame of inviting applications to serve as the interim mayor, we actually had this real weird kind of interregnum that created this particular challenge. So we've wondered, number one, in a case like that where you have a sitting mayor who resigns following an election in which one is appointed, could the statute just say that the elected mayor would serve automatically as the interim mayor, as opposed to having to go through the standard practice? So again, it doesn't happen very often. I can't think honestly of another circumstance like this in the time I've been in Utah, but it did create this kind of strange animal. And in addition to that, with the acting mayor also being the council chair, for example, if the council were to pass an ordinance or a resolution, the acting mayor who serves as the council chair would actually sign twice, and it sort of eliminated that check and balance question between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So that's where it gets just a little tricky, and I don't know exactly what the answer is, but it did create some kind of strange anomalies.
But I might just add, it wasn't the same, it wasn't with the mayor, but we have had one previous instance where the same type of circumstance happened with a council member where a vacancy occurred after the election had already happened.
Yeah.
And again, we went through the public process of appointing an interim council member and appointed the person who had just been elected. And so that's happened once before too.
So is this something that you want us to look at? I don't think it's a pressing need, but that needs to happen immediately. But is this something that you are?
It would be a simple fix, a couple lines perhaps in the code. And of course, somebody has to run a bill. And I know bills are precious to the legislators because they're, you have priority of 3, I think, right? But somewhere along the line, I think we think it would just be a simple tweak, but somebody's got to run it.
Might be a good political operations interim issue for this year.
If council would like, we'll just reach out to the political operations committee at the legislature and see that's something they can look at.
I would think that this is something that the league would want to take up.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's not just that circumstance. There are other circumstances where you could have a need to fill a vacancy. We address that for leave of absence with the guard, but we didn't have this particular situation with Mayor Brent Taylor. He serves on UTA's board.
Mm-hmm.
We're silent on what happens with UTA's board, and yet he was duly appointed, patriotic, serving our country, going to Afghanistan. And so this is something that the interim government operations, I think they probably ought to bear down. But I recommend you guys go back to the league, work with the league, because what we do for Provo, we don't.
It has implications.
Okay, we'll reach out.
Good, thanks.
Thank you. Cliff?
The third item is simply this idea of changing the form of government, particularly for our county. We are the second largest county, and we're projected to grow by significant amounts in the next 20 years. And we think that 20 or three commission members trying to run a county this size is probably inadequate at this point. And I think the council members would encourage that the form of government be changed. We know it can happen at the legislature. The process for cities can't initiate it on their own, but council may be considering a resolution to at least encourage that change.
We have 3 currently.
3.
It's for 3 full-time commissioners that are both
That was a
executive.
joke, Norm.
Well,
I'm sorry, Norm.
It's early, it's early.
Senator Henderson and I and others signed a letter asking one of them to step down, and he's not been functioning.
I was on that letter, but
Which brings us to the next point, which really is this question of, could maybe the same committee at the legislature in the interim look at recall provisions or something when we're dealing with compromised elected officials?
That's very tricky. That's really a tricky thing. We've experienced that in Salt Lake with was it the county assessor?
Salt Lake County's
Recorder.
So we have
And
Senate
there
Bill,
is a bill that's
Senate Bill
dealing with that.
38. Actually, Dan Thatcher, that is specifically dealing with removing an elected county official for mental
But
incapacity.
it only deals with counties of the first class, sorry.
What does that mean?
Salt Lake County,
Salt
only
Lake.
county it applies to.
Is that by population level?
It's because they were concerned about, yes, but they're concerned about a commission of 3, 2 people being able to gang up on one person. So they wanted to make sure it was a different form of government that applied to. So it's a tricky issue. It's a really, really difficult issue. And we tried to make sure there were a lot of checks and balances. But that bill did go through the Political Subdivisions Interim Committee. And I think there was 1 dissenting vote on it. But it's, and some of the officials in other counties and cities aren't very happy because it doesn't apply to them.
Right.
And they can't use it. But if you have any other ideas or thoughts on how to change that, we're certainly open to it.
One of the challenges we have in the recall issue is demonstrated by Arizona, our neighbors to the south. The sitting Senate president was involved in some legislation dealing with immigration, Senate Bill 1070. It was not very popular among a broader constituency, and so he was recalled, not because of any incapacity, malfeasance in office, high crimes and misdemeanors, or whatever else the code references. In other words, there was no act that he had committed outside his responsibilities, but they didn't like a policy position. Now, this is a man who called me personally a traitor from the podium twice in 2 different meetings as we were running legislation here in Utah back in 2011. So he and I were not on the same page on policy dealing with immigration. I mean, to be called a traitor at a national legislative meeting, not once, but 2 weeks in a row, 2 different meetings, whatever, you'd think I'd be sympathetic with him being recalled and supported. I didn't, because he was recalled based on a policy call, okay? And the challenge you have with recalls is you can't take politics out of politics, and if you don't like what someone has done, look what's happening across the country right now dealing with harassment. And we need to all be sensitive to that. But should someone be taken out of office because someone doesn't like speech or a vote? And that's really what we're dealing with. So as Senator Henderson said, it's a very difficult proposition.
It is, and you got to keep it fairly narrow if you want to avoid the policy questions, because we've all had elected officials that we have disagreed with, and you don't want that to be the reason why you recall somebody. But certainly ethics and higher issues would be something that you try to narrow it to.
That's one of the reasons I think 3 becomes more important. I think it actually even becomes harder if we have a different form of government rather than just 3 people. I think if we have more people involved, I think
Well, I think if you become more people involved, you right now you've got someone who is compromised, and really the other 2 are really running the county at that point. And I think if you had 7 or 5 or a larger number, then you've got more ability to be flexible about the policy decisions.
So the other counties are feeling second class here, and
some lower than that.
I would think whatever works for one form of government would be applicable in the second-class counties. So that's one change I would think about.
Well, it gets complicated, like the Senator was saying. When you have Salt Lake County where you have 7 council members and you're going to take an action to remove the county recorder and you've got to get, all 7 or 3/4 or something like that. That's a little bit of a higher bar than if you have a county where there's 3 commissioners and 2 of them can remove anybody. It just changes the dynamics in a way that you have to think through how that plays out. I think you're right. I think it does need to be addressed for all of the counties. And I think what the committee is doing is they're starting with the big one first, and then it should expand as they learn how it works.
There's another issue. Should it also be applied to cities? Apparently you have a city councilman up north who has been accused of extortion. And there's some ethics. I don't know what the facts are. I don't know if there's merit or not. I just read the paper. So what we do for political subdivisions, it really is a difficult proposition because it's very challenging, again, to take politics out of the equation.
And it is complicated, and complicating it further, the Ethics Act actually states that one of the penalties for violation is that the person shall be dismissed from employment or removed from office, but it doesn't provide a procedure for removing them from office if it's an elected official. And so it's kind of an open question about whether it's.
Some elected officials do have we can, after following an ethics process,
Right.
we can expel one of our own members, or executive branch elected official can be impeached. But you're right, on the local level, and maybe there needs to be a process like that after a thorough independent ethics investigation type of thing, a mechanism for certain circumstances.
There are 2 bill files open right now under my name. We have a political subdivisions ethics commission and we have a executive branch ethics commission. Both of those commissions work closely with Senator Valentine. I think you were involved with some of that when you first got elected, weren't you? I can't remember. Anyhow, we've had a couple of cases come through now in both of those, and so the executive directors have come back and they said there are some things we need to do to fine tune the process. So as we go through that, I'll be meeting next week with the executive directors of both those ethics commissions. We'll take a look at this and see if there's something that can be done this session.
Thank you. And I also, as we get going, but maybe we as a council ought to get together and have a discussion about the county government and decide if there's anything that we have any interest in, a resolution or.
Right.
I don't know what direction we need to go with that. We just want you guys to know that this is something that we have a little concern around at this point.
I hope that you'll be speaking with Commissioners Lee and Ivy on this. Like, they're not necessarily on the same page on this, but they both have some good ideas. And I think it's important that we have their input.
Thank you. I agree. Thank you. Let's move on to item number 5. Dave, you wanted to take a minute on that?
Yeah, this came up the other day. We noticed that the legislature is looking at the UTA, which is good. The proposal is perhaps to have a 3-member commission governing UTA, and considering our experience lately with the county with a 3-member commission, we weren't necessarily enamored with that. The other concerns came up about cities currently have input and involvement by putting people onto the board, and so some feel that the cities would feel disenfranchised. So I'm not against changing things and greater involvement and scrutiny from the state. It's just how to go about that.
Just ask, just a kind of a conceptual statement, how would you feel about the UTA being more strongly under the control of the legislature or the governor's office? What if we made it an agency of the executive branch where the legislature has some direct oversight over that versus what it is today, which is mostly independent of the legislature and executive branch.
The independent nature can be both good and bad depending on how you look at it. But I like to have things that are representative, so that the people most affected feel like they have some say in what's going on.
Is there some way to combine the two alternatives so it's not quite absolute autonomy versus absolute oversight?
It does get difficult because it's easy to say, well, they're completely independent and here's how their board's made up. And it's easy to say, well, they're under the executive branch, they're under the role of the governor, and the legislature regulates them through whatever appropriations process we need to do. You try to kind of put a hybrid in place. It can be done, but it kind of waters down both aspects of it. So you have this, because one side is either advisory and the other side really controls, or that's kind of what it ends up being, is that one side is really in control, but the other side is there to squeak. And how much they get hurt is always an issue.
I have a unique perspective on this because the empty seat right there, when George was mayor in 1996, he appointed me to serve on the UTA board, and it was a Provo appointment. And I had to make a commitment to him. Number one, I would fill the 4 year before he extended the invitation. That I'd fulfill the 4-year term, that I would report back to the city, that I was a city's representative. And there was an accountability back to elected officials. That was from 96 to 2000. In August of 2000, I was reappointed, but I was no longer reappointed by Provo. I was appointed by 18 cities. And to be accountable to 18 means you're accountable to none. The challenge we have with UTA right now is one of accountability. When you look at the financial challenges, when you look at the runaway inflation of executive bonuses and compensation and travel and all the other things, that's a direct reflection on the lack of accountability and transparency. When you look at what the promise of UTA was in 1996, they were at 13% fare box recovery. Fare box recovery defined as the amount of revenue received from paid ridership as a percentage of the total operating costs, not dealing with any of the capital expenditures. And the promise of tracks and the other things that we were doing was that we would move it to as high as a 40% fare box recovery. Today, we're $2 point some billion in debt, and we're at 13% fare box recovery. And even though we're only 13% fare box recovery from the private sector, and it's all tax dollars, look at the extraordinary executive compensation and the other things that are happening, and that's defined as lack of accountability. That's why the legislature is paying attention, because Provo City and all the accountability that, Dave, that you'd like to see doesn't exist with the UTA board right now, because you have no direct way to tell your representative on the board to get their act together, or you're going to replace them. So that's what we're dealing with at the legislature. That's why there's this discussion of governance. It's a real challenge.
And they came in to one of our interim revenue taxation committee meetings to kind of report on how they were doing, and they were excited to report on all of the new tax revenue that they got from Prop 1, and told us about all of the money that they had spent and how they had spent it, but could not answer any questions about, has ridership increased? You know, I mean, and the fare box recovery, I mean, the subsidies for ridership is just astronomical. And there's no, it was deer in the headlights when it came to how are you getting more riders, and are your routes actually and your times, are they feasible? We don't care about you just being able to spend money. Anybody can spend money. So there is a huge lack of accountability, and as we try to grapple with this, it's going to take some time, I think, to be able to really get it under control. And I'm not sure what the answer is exactly, but there definitely needs to be more accountability, because it's taxpayer. I mean, they get earmarks, sales tax revenue earmarks, and they just get it automatically. That's why they want earmarks, because they don't have to go through the appropriations process. They just get it.
Well, look, there's a culture in the Provo City Council, the mayor's office, there is in the legislature. We deal with tax dollars. And while you have a dedicated revenue stream, your local option, when you set your budgets, there's a tension with that budget. UTA doesn't view the revenue that they have as public dollars. They view it as their dollars. And it's their dollars to spend as they see fit. And that's the lack of accountability is a real serious challenge for us. UTA hasn't figured out, are they subsidized socialized transportation for those economically unable to provide transportation for themselves? And that's a legitimate public purpose. But is that their primary mission? Or is it to move the greatest number of people in the most efficient manner, dealing with congestion, air pollution, and the other kinds of challenges? And those sometimes collide, and UTA hasn't clearly defined those goals, and that's manifest by what they do with the funds they receive.
That's a tough one. That is a hard one. And if we have any input, we encourage the council members, administration to.
Well, this goes back to Norm's question. Would you rather have the legislature that has accountability, and we can be unelected, having more direct oversight? Because there's not one city in the state right now that has the kind of oversight necessary to create that type of accountability.
So I've heard that there's so much debt with the UTA that the state really didn't want to take it over because it would affect your credit rating, and that's very concerning. So I think the state does need to be able to have oversight and control what's going on here, because it seems like it's a little out of control.
And Dave, that's exactly what we're wrestling with. We don't want to take on that debt, but we've heard that.
I think ultimately the buck stops with us anyway.
Yeah.
I mean,
The full faith and credit, this issue about it affecting the state's credit rating, it's a service area. Under the law, it's a service area. If it were to default, it falls back on the full faith and credit of the state right now, as does any political subdivision.
I'm getting ideas.
I think it might be fair to say that I would be surprised, if it went back to the legislature, you'd still have an administration. It would be probably like any other department. But I think that the local government entities would probably want to have some kind of board, like we have the water board and stuff over at Department of Natural Resources and stuff.
Wayne Harper has the bill file open on this. There have been significant discussions, but when that bill, I don't know what the final form is going to take. We haven't seen even a draft yet, but I'd encourage you to watch for it and weigh in. I just looked at Wayne's. It's transportation governance amendments. It just still shows in process, so we don't have any.
Thank you.
Just based on what you've said so far, I do like the idea of having UTA be more accountable to our elected state officials. Just trying to compare that in my mind to independent body. I'm trying to think who are they accountable to, and who does what.
Another example would be like Utah Retirement Systems. That's something that you were all part of, I believe. But they are accountable to the legislature. They have their structure, but they come and report to retirement independent entities, and we monitor them very closely for solvency and policy, and we ask that they do things differently from time to time.
But part of this has been UTA. When I was first appointed to the board, I was accountable to Provo City. I've already mentioned that. During my tenure on the board, we got a new general counsel. The new general counsel mandated that corporate governance and board governance, that board members had to be their priority, and their agenda had to be loyal to UTA, not the state, not the taxpayers. That it was, if you had a conflict, you had that it was UTA was your constituency, not the taxpayers. And that change in culture, this was right at the end of my time on the board. I didn't support that, but that has dramatically changed how UTA has moved forward.
I can see the tension there, that the more independence UTA has, assuming sound leadership and responsible behavior, the idea there is that you're doing long-term planning and you don't want to be constantly having to be answerable to 2-year, 4-year election cycles in order to plan something that's 20 or 30 years out. Is that so? I mean, it seems like if there's legislative oversight over UTA and there's more accountability, the only lingering concern seems to me to be able to give UTA enough flexibility so that they can actually effectively lay out those plans and
Is that like the Mountain View corridor for UDOT or some of the other companies? In other words, we deal with that already. The real challenge is over the last 10 or 15 years, when you see $50,000 and $80,000 bonuses, and when you see the other kinds of things, it's not the planning, it's not the controversies of BRT or those kinds of things that the legislature is concerned about it. That long range, taking the long view, that's not been part of our discussion. It's the operational accountability.
I see.
Thank you. We'll follow up on those things too, and just keep you informed of our concerns. And like I said, good luck with that. That's a challenge. We're gonna let's move to number 6 briefly, because I really do want to hear about some of the things that they see.
So, recently we've had occasion to meet with Peter Christensen of the Realtors, and they supported our rental contract ordinance, but in exchange for that, it was like, well, we'll support that if you remove something that we don't like. And we said, well, what's that? Well, we really don't like your requirement that we disclose at the time of sale the true nature of the property with a zoning disclosure, so the purchaser knows what zone it's in and what's allowed, the allowable uses. And he says that's just an unreasonable requirement. It's buyer beware, that they should take care of that on their own, and we shouldn't have to give that information. And in contrast to that opinion, we have Scott Murray, who's on our housing committee, who's a realtor, and Scott says, gee, the very first thing you should do when you're putting a property up for sale is go get that zoning disclosure. It should be made available online, push a button and it comes up. It should be so easy to find out what is the legal use of the property, and that should be advertised just like you do with selling a car and how many miles are on it. It's just truth in advertising. And he says, you shouldn't even be able to list a property unless you have that information available. So there's 2 different ways to look at it, and if the state wanted to adopt something, that might be quite the battle with the realtors, but yes.
Sorry, you can finish your thought.
Oh, well, I'm just saying that's a concern, and right now Provo is probably the only one requiring zoning disclosure, but if it was statewide and required before you list a property to have that information available, there's so many people that buy properties, and afterwards they go, well, I was told that it was a legal duplex or an accessory apartment, or
6 people in here.
yeah, 6 people in here, all that stuff.
So I don't know if we both submitted the same topic, but I wanted to discuss it as well. And I think you did an excellent job kind of setting the stage on why we feel, we've had this for 15 or so years, we feel like it's been good. And I always assumed that they didn't like it because, hey, it's lucrative to have, property is more valuable if it's used, you sell it for uses that aren't necessarily allowed. But when we had that discussion with Peter Christensen, as I was listening to his complaints about it, it wasn't, well, we don't want to disclose, or, it's a hassle for us. What I got out of it was their biggest concern, because that's what I always thought it was, but their biggest concern is Provo itself is requiring this, and they don't like the precedents that different cities within the county can have their own regulations. And so now if you're working countywide, it's American Fork, I have to do these things, and in Provo, I have to do these other things. And if it's easy to forget one of those things, and you open yourself up for liability and lawsuits and all of that stuff. And so it's, as I'm listening to this, it's like, oh, so your concern is that it's kind of location specific. And I asked in the meeting, I asked, so if this is your concern, would you support a regulation like this that's statewide? And he wasn't committal about, yeah, we'd support it, but he also wasn't opposed to it, which I thought was quite remarkable. And so I personally think there's a huge protection to the buyer, because many people go in without a whole lot of experience. They may not do their due diligence because that's not what they do. They don't understand those kind of things. That's why they hire a professional to look out for their interests. And these professionals aren't necessarily giving them the zoning disclosure. So I think a statewide, particularly if the realtors wouldn't oppose it, because it's now statewide, my one tweak for it would be that it's not done at the time of sale, as Mr. Murray was suggesting. You do it early on in the process, so people, it's not just one of the 110 pages you have to sign, but early on, so people understand the use restrictions.
Yeah, Scott actually he doesn't like the way it is now, where it is at the time of sale and just one of many documents. He said, get it done before you can even list it. One of the requirements, just like you got to have your lead disclosure and other things. If you don't have it, you don't list.
And if you're not listing that, in this market today, we have a lot of people that are listing now, and that becomes a challenge. So then it'd have to be done at the time of sale or something like that.
Well, just to clarify, it's not currently at the time of sale, it's at the time of the signing of the agreement to purchase. So not at the closing, but at the timing of the contract.
It's something that may be better at a state level and may not receive the resistance from the realtors if it's done at the state level rather than kind of spot legislation.
So I've talked with Peter about this same issue too. And my impression is that they feel like they're generally regulated by the state. And this seems to be kind of an odd exception where there's this municipal regulation in one city in the state, at least that we're aware of, that is regulating them. So it does seem like it should either be handled at the state level or maybe we should add the requirement in Provo if it can't be done at the state level.
One final thought was he also threw out a line of logic in order to dismiss what we currently have on the books, rather than saying you really ought to go statewide. He was arguing, well, you need to get rid of the Provo because your new landlord contract ordinance has a disclosure in there, and that disclosure is really all that's needed. And my response to that is that's a disclosure between the landlord and the tenant, and what we're trying to address is between the seller and the buyer, who becomes the new landlord, who thinks he has a piece of property, then it turns out not to be what he thought.
Thank you very much. You've heard what we have. I don't know what we do about this, but we can
I'm not persuaded that state law doesn't already cover lack of disclosure on that, something that would be a material impact on the value of the property.
It does sound like something that the League of Cities and Towns, if it's a priority for you, the League of Cities and Towns to talk with the other cities and towns. I mean, it just seems to me that they would be the natural group to put this forward to the state. Whenever the league comes and says, like, here's something that all the cities agree that we would like the state to do to us, it's a little more compelling than when one city, this is something that we'd like you to do to all the other cities. It's just slightly more compelling when it's done that way.
I don't think there's would be an appetite in the legislature, at least not in the Business Labor Committee, which is where this would fall, to statutorily prohibit cities from requiring disclosures that would directly affect the market value of property. So to the extent that the realtors would be asking to override Provo's ordinance to say you can't do that, the optics of that just are, I don't see it.
Thank you. We'll get with the league and go that direction to start with. Apologies to Mr. Harding and Mr. Henley on these last two items, but I'd like to hear, I know last year we had a real challenge with transfer. We talked a lot about transfer. And we also talked about funding for roads that were really hot items, I think, last year in the legislature. And I'd like to hear anything you have about those, and what do you think?
We say transfer.
Utility transfer.
We use our utility,
Enterprise
but, what do we call it?
Enterprise funds.
Enterprise funds, right. Transfers for the enterprise.
Well, the issue there is one of, the utility is not regulated by the PSC. And to the extent that a city has, right now we have certain criteria for raising taxes. You guys are aware of that, called truth in taxation and whatever. And so if using a utility to circumvent truth in taxation, so you raise utility fees so you can then transfer to the general fund, where if you had to address it with the citizens, that would be a challenge. That's why the legislature is having some concerns.
I think for me, the issue is resolved if you just have a truth in taxation like approach to your
Utility.
Yeah, it's real simple.
And it's itemized on the utility bill, it's transparent.
Because that's the corollary to a public service commission hearing.
And it's perfectly legitimate way of running your city. And there's lots of reasons to do it that way because of the nonprofits and all that thing. It's just that we just would like that extra step of saying, well, if you're going to do it that way, tell the citizens that you're going to do it that way.
We do that now. We send a separate notice in our utility bill that at the time of public hearing, we'll have a separate public hearing, not just part of the budget hearing. We actually hold a separate public hearing, separately noticed, at which our residents can come and can talk to us. I think last year we worked with Representative Moss and did a much better disclosure bill. I think we all agreed certainly raised the bar for cities. And I think we're very comfortable with the disclosure question.
Thank you. Is there anything?
Senator Dayton, have you heard anything coming up on this year?
On this particular issue,
Yeah.
not on this one.
Okay, fine.
I think we addressed it last year,
You did.
and I don't think there's been further.
Thank you.
Along the same lines, though, there is a concern, and it does stem from Provo City, on the transportation utility fees. And so I did want to briefly get your take on that. Charging that fee to the county. I mean, I can see how that could be problematic for counties, having, a whole bunch of different cities starting to charge them those fees. And so I just wanted to get your take and your feedback on that.
I'll give you my feedback on that. I know that aren't supposed to think we're different, but I think Provo is different in many, many ways because of having two universities here. We have the two largest universities in the state. And I think that the students that go to the Orem University actually want to live in Provo so that they can have the BYU experience. A lot of times they can't have that BYU experience away from Provo. We are unique. We have the university. We have hospitals. We have.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not disputing
No.
the need for something like that, especially for Provo City. I totally understand that.
And with that understanding, it's hard for us to, in my mind, to separate one tax exempt group from another tax exempt group. And I think of I understand it if we just only have one or two where everybody is receiving the value, but we have so many people coming from the county, from BYU, from our nonprofit organizations. 50% of our property is non-taxable. And that makes it unique and challenging. And so as we come forward with that, I think that I'd like to protect as much as we can that UTF for our city. And I understand that other cities are going forward, and I don't know whether anything now is coming forward in the legislature. But to me, we are unique, and it's a critical way for us to fund our city at this point.
And yes, and I agree with that. My concern is all, 24 cities in Utah County suddenly starting to tax,
I get
levy
that.
that fee on the county. Counties are different than a school or, a hospital. They have lots of different cities that they have to deal with. And so that's my concern.
Can I just weigh in there and say that everything that Mr. Winterton just described was the motivation for thinking about what to do, but it doesn't have anything to do with the fee itself as far as the fact that it is a fee, not a tax, right? And so the issue for the county is in the
Can you
same.
define that difference?
Sure. So remember, so our power department is a utility. And the county has their county headquarters in Provo City, and they have a power meter in Provo City. So they pay a fee, they pay a rate to Provo Power based on the energy that they use. Likewise, what our ordinance has done is it has said the maintenance of our streets is a utility. Okay, it is a service that Provo City provides to the residents and consumers and users of Provo City roads. It is a utility that the city runs. And so what they have done is they have said those who use Provo City roads pay a fee. It's very similar to, but you don't have a meter. There's no way to hook up a meter to that. But we've used national trip generation statistics to calculate as best we can in what we believe to be a reasonable manner, how each entity that is using our roads uses them and generate that fee. So to the extent that it's a concern that every city in the county is going to start generating that fee, they could only do that to the extent that the county actually has operations inside their city. And that those operations are reasonably connected to their use of the roads.
So is State Street a state utility that we assess Provo City a fee for the use of the state utility?
It could be. I don't know that the state has defined that as a utility.
I'm just following that logic a step further.
Well, and what I'm saying is that this goes back to the point of what Mr. Winterton was saying before, is that the customary practice is to fund roads through taxation, right? That's the customary model. But there's nothing that says that that's the only model out there for funding roads, right? But that is the customary model. And in most cities, it works because of the issue that Mr. Winterton just raised. In Provo City, it doesn't work very well, but that doesn't mean that it's not a utility, or that it's not something that we can calculate how much each person is using in order to assign them a fee. That's just not the customary model, and we understand that it's not the customary model.
Right. Well, I think those are some interesting arguments. I still have concern about the practice of cities, and it is a tax. I mean, a fee is a tax by another name, and you know.
Not according to the case law, but.
Well, ultimately, it's the taxpayers of the state of Utah who are going to be paying twice, essentially, for those services. I mean, they're paying for them themselves through their own utility fees, and then the counties are going to have to start generating more revenue through their own taxes. It's double dipping in the taxpayer pockets, in my opinion. And so it is a concern, especially with counties, because in Utah County in particular has already had more than just Provo trying to assess this fee on them. And so it's a concern for me. And I am looking at legislation I don't want to pull the rug out from under anybody, especially not Provo. But as far as taxing the actual county, I think that entity is different than the other entities because it touches so many cities. And I think that there's a justifiable reason to exempt the county.
Here's the practical implications. The counties are funded primarily through property tax. Cities don't have the ability to assess property tax for transportation currently. So what you're effectively doing, whether you call it a fee, a tax, or a charitable contribution, is you're effectively trying to force the county to use property tax dollars to fund your roads. And yet the legislature has not granted that taxing authority to cities for transportation. And that's the practical reality of what this assessment is doing at the county level.
So question, So how do you suggest we take care of our roads with all these students, and the county commission is located here and all their employees come in on our roads and out, and so we're 50% held harmless. How are we gonna fund that? How are we gonna compensate that for that? There's not a single other city, when you put us in this generality of 17 cities or whatnot, that's great, but we're unique. We're not like 17 other cities.
I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't levy the utility fee on nonprofits or on the state or schools. I think that's different than the county, because the county has, in Utah County, 24 cities in its jurisdiction. So I'm suggesting, and I don't know what the practical implications of that are. I would like to know from your perspective what that means. So I'm not saying that you should.
You just want us to hold Billy and that, our county commissioners, harmless when it comes to this fee.
I don't care about the commissioners. I care about the policy. So and that's why I'm looking for feedback.
So there's the principle and then there's the practicality of it. And I know there's a lot to be said about the principle. But in practice, the fact that we're asking for $2,000 a year, and we're probably at the top end of what any of the 24 would ever possibly be able to justify. The dollar amount is very, very small. But then if you say, okay, it's not about the dollars, it's about the principle, there's a lot to be said. I view the different government entities kind of like within Provo, we have different departments, and we all use services within the city, and each department that uses services reimburses the other departments or that provided those services. And I don't see, you asked about should we be paying money for State Street or state roads. The state has the ability to ask the counties and the cities who use the services to pay whatever seems appropriate. And I think it should work both ways, that nobody should get a free ride. No department gets free utilities or free janitorial cleaning. So it's just a matter of equality.
And I get that. And you talk about all the people that come in to work in Provo. Don't they shop and eat in Provo as well? I think that there's a little bit of give and take here. I don't think it's all Provo giving. I think that there is some, that you benefit also from the people coming and working in your city. So but this can be an ongoing discussion. I don't want to take the whole time up, and I don't want to do anything that's going to harm Provo. I truly don't.
So we're worried about that.
So,
just so you know.
It's a big deal.
Well, it's a big deal for us. What you're
the $2,000?
Well, yeah, let me win there. What we're worried about is defending the fee as a method of funding.
I don't. You don't have to worry about that.
And so,
from me,
to the degree that the county came to us and asked to be exempted from a legal perspective only here, not from policy, and so I'm not speaking for any of the policymakers, it was very troublesome to think about granting an exemption that undermines where we are ourselves undermining our own fee, right? But to the extent that, again, legally only, to the extent that there's an exemption being granted by the state that takes away that $2,000 but doesn't do anything else to harm the fee and the ability to harm for us to charge the fee to everybody else, me personally, I don't have a problem with that from a legal perspective, if that makes sense.
I hope, I guess I didn't make myself very clear. I don't want to undermine that fee. I do get that Provo is in a
nonprofit,
an especially difficult situation.
And a government entity.
I do.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
The transportation task force that is recommending that is a reasonable
Sure, because if
way.
you're something, then the next person comes in line. I get that.
I know
Slippery slope.
There's more discussion, and we're gonna have Isaac, isn't that Isaac's job over here to
it's Isaac, so I should stop talking.
There's a lot more
And just
discussion
throw
that
it
we'd
to
like to have
Isaac.
on this.
Okay.
Before any of you go, is there what else? Is there anything else? Now, Kurt, you mentioned some things that you see down the road.
I have a meeting at 4:00 Tuesday on something that has been popping up across the country that deals with our cell phones. And it's called small cell deployment, 5G. And it's primarily for urban areas. It doesn't affect much in the way of rural. But right now, there's no framework per se statewide for telecommunications companies, wireless companies, and municipalities to deal with the changing technology with small cell deployment. And what we've seen across the country, there are, I think, a dozen or two states, I'm not sure what the exact number is, I think it's 12 or 18 or something states that have adopted a statewide standard for the wireless technology to be deployed within the state in terms of permitting, zoning, fee structure, whatever. I was talking with Cameron Deal yesterday. Our approach has always been on telecommunications to partner with the league and with cities on how we develop telecommunications policy. The challenge is that if a city says we're going to prohibit these small cells in a particular zone, if we're going to have an application process that takes 3 years to approve, if we're going to, the state law right now says that in the right-of-ways that you can't charge more than your actual cost of the right-of-way. That was something that was negotiated in 2003. So other states that have had something like that they've been very creative. A city would say, well, okay, Sewell Communications, you're going to pay what our costs are. Connect Communications, you're going to pay what our costs are. Parker Communications, you're going to pay what our costs are, because the ordinance says you can't charge more than what your cost is. Okay?
So did we just collect 3 times?
Or 10 times.
Okay.
Or whatever. And so the wireless, this came up at national meetings called the Wireless University. It came up at a TechNet conference in San Francisco with the CEOs of all the major wireless companies. And our history of working through this has been to partner with the league rather than to have a top-down mandate. And so I have a bill file open, meeting with the league on Tuesday at 4 o'clock at Legislative Research Offices. I welcome someone from Provo City to participate. We're not looking at trying to dictate, but rather we'd like to work with the league and with the cities to set some parameters under which ordinances would fall for these areas of zoning, fees, application process, et cetera. Because the reality is, this 5G, what it is, it's distributed cell sites. It's no longer one big cell tower. You know, Provo City up Canyon Road or up University Avenue, we have that pine tree. Lovely. That was a direct result of the tension and citizens saying we want the service, but we don't want the site. Okay, and so this is more a heads up. We welcome your input. Again, we want it to be, my approach, I hope, will be something that is collaborative, not coercive.
Senator Bremmel, if I might just weigh in, that also came up at the last year's meetings of the American Public Power Association at the legal seminar. One of the concerns that some of the public power agencies have had is that some states are getting into the issue not just about the fees and the process, but essentially requiring cities to allow whatever and wherever, right? And we have a lot of concerns about that, because some of these providers, they come in and they tell whoever they're lobbying, oh, it's the size of a pizza box. But then the fine print of the contract says, but we have to install support devices that are the size of a refrigerator underneath the pole, right? And so there are concerns that way. But I don't necessarily have.
Did I mention 4 o'clock Tuesday?
Yes, and I think that'd be great for somebody to be to maybe.
Where is it?
Or
it's at the Legislative Research in Democrat. It'll be the West Office building, the Lockhart. The Deputy Lockhart House building on the 2nd floor.
Anything else?
No. I can't think of anything specifically that would affect cities and towns, except for we had our all-day caucus yesterday, and we spent a third of our time talking about budget. From the House's perspective, while the news media is reporting this fabulous financial year and all of this extra money, we're not seeing it that way. We're saying that this is a chance for us to dig ourselves out of some pretty deep holes that we're in. There's not going to be a lot of money for new things and for for new expensive commitments, anything like that, we're we tend to be fairly conservative anyway when it comes to spending. So that shouldn't really directly relate to cities and towns. Just kind of letting you know that that's the general feeling in the House is that this is going to be a tight budget year. It's going to be difficult for us to meet our commitments and do what we need to do. And especially if we're going to do anything at all for education this year, that's going to really put some boundaries as to what we can accomplish for anything else.
Thanks. Anything else, Margaret?
I have one issue that could be discussed at some point in your city councils, and it's dealing with animals in restaurants and grocery stores. Been working on this for a number of years because there's a lot of violation of the Americans with Disabilities. I think we're all very supportive of true service animals for the blind and disabled. But there is a real abuse of that with a lot of people claiming their support animals need to go into stores and restaurants. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of constituent concern generated from Provo. There's a lot of pictures taken from people in Provo and surrounding areas. We're not the only problem in the state, but we're trying to figure out the best way to enforce it and hoping right now that cities will be more assertive in posting that no animals, no pets should be in restaurants and grocery stores. There's a lot of associated problems with that. Your input is great if you have it on that. We are working with the ADA people on a national level, but we also have a lot of concerns on the local level because there just are not enough people in the Department of Agriculture who protects our food. They've got 14 people throughout the state to try to enforce it, and stores and restaurants just are not protecting the public from those people who choose to bring their animals in and let them sit at the tables or walk around the produce or sit in the grocery cart. So that's just one of the issues.
Thank you, Dave.
So speaking of the public health, came up on the news yesterday about hepatitis A outbreak and whether we should require all service handlers to have that shot.
No, you can see there's a lot of additional concerns going forward with protection for the public on this. So.
If you can extend it to the airline industry, that'd be great.
Oh, they're the worst of all. They've kind of generated the problem allowing people to bring pigs and ducks as support animals.
Pigs and ducks?
Pigs and ducks. We have pictures of it.
Yeah. And just so everybody knows, under the ADA, the only dogs qualify as service animals. So if you see anything that's not a dog, it's not.
Only trained dogs.
Trained dogs. Only
And
trained dogs.
they're, yeah.
Now, difference between service animal and
And a support animal.
and a support animal.
Yeah.
Support animal is basically, it's an animal that makes you feel better.
Right.
But they're also protected.
They're not protected.
No, they're not protected.
As I called BYU, I have a situation and they said, good luck, you got to support cat, 2 of them.
You know what? We've already passed legislation that says that can't be allowed unless BYU chooses to allow it because they're not as, they're a private university. If they choose to allow that kind of thing, they can.
That's interesting. That's great.
Anyway, thank you for your time. It's good to have your input. Appreciate your work.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I guess we need to officially close and then we can.
I would like to just add a couple of things, legislators. A number of the council members are going to come up for Local Officials Day and
Which is on the 24th.
24th, and they would love for you to sit with them at lunch and be able to continue conversations.
Would they be interested in sitting with us on the floor?
Possibly, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, on the floor of the House, floor of the Senate.
Some chambers allow that. I mean, it's not standard.
Yeah, the House, for the House, it's not a problem. You guys just change your rules. I don't know what your rules are anymore.
You change it too much.
Will you follow up with them on that, Cliff?
I will, and I'll tell you right now too, if the 2 items, especially on the 2 items that we didn't get to, if those council members would give me something to send in, include in the letter, I'll send a letter following up to all the legislators, because I know not everybody was here, but very much thank them for being here and just follow up with the conversation.
What day is that again?
24th.
January 24th. That's the 3rd day of the session.
Wow, right off the bat.
Thank you for inviting us. I hope you don't always have to meet this early in the morning.
We do it whatever you want.
I think we should all get up at the crack of 10, so it's very nice to be here with you this morning. Thank you for breakfast and for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Good to see you.
We will adjourn by acclamation, I guess.